So, Minister, today at this Ag Council, Ireland are planning on presenting a paper. There's been some support from other groups on this issue of targets and how they're calculated.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big challenges that we face in the European Union is to be a world leader in terms of climate change and finding a way to reduce global emissions while doing all of the other things that we have to do as an economy, as a union, and so on. And so what we're focusing on today is ensuring that ministers for agriculture have a say in the setting of targets for 2030 in terms of emissions and climate change targets, and making sure that the complexity of food production responding to the challenges of food security are also part of the climate change debate. And Ireland has always said that we in Ireland, and indeed we collectively as a European Union, need to give global leadership in terms of climate smart agriculture, finding a way to produce more food or as much food while reducing the emissions intensity of that food production. And whether it's dairy or whether it's beef or whether it's pigs and poultry, Ireland has a pretty good record on that to date. But certainly in the context of the European Union setting new targets for climate change between 2020 and 2030, agriculture, which represents nearly 10% of Europe's emissions, and in Ireland's case it represents more than 30% of our emissions, needs to be very much part of that debate, and we're insisting on that today. We have the support of another 15 countries in that, in our approach, which is to look at new ways of setting targets and benchmarks for agriculture and food production to ensure that it's sustainable, but also to ensure that we're contributing positively to a global problem of climate change, as opposed to doing something in the confines of the European Union and contributing to a problem outside of the European Union.
What about our climate change targets for 2020, though? It seems that Ireland is going to be in difficulty in meeting some of its targets in terms of emissions before 2020. Are you concerned about that?
Well, you're saying that. I'm not. I mean, I think
Do you think Ireland will reach its emissions targets in terms of agriculture emissions?
Well, I mean, first of all, we haven't set specific targets for agriculture for 2020. Ireland has a collective target for 2020 which we need to meet. And obviously agriculture is part of that collective and needs to do everything it can to reduce emissions from a sector, while at the same time fulfilling our potential in terms of growth and expansion. But the most important thing that Ireland needs to do is it needs to be the world leader, as far as I'm concerned, in climate smart agriculture, in producing food at as low a carbon footprint as possible. And we are, as I say, already making good progress on that, but I think we can do better.
And Minister, part of the solution, as I understand it, is that the methane emissions from our national herd would be offset in some way against carbon sink of our pastures. That would be a big change if we achieve that. Do you think that's possible?
Well, absolutely, I do. I mean, you know, the Commission produced a paper in January which is suggesting for the first time that we need to look at agriculture and land use perhaps differently to how we might look at transport or energy generation or home heating and so on. And that is because, you know, you don't want to set targets for countries and for the European Union that simply transfers food production to other parts of the world that are producing food at a much higher emissions intensity than, say, Ireland or European countries. So what we need to do here is debate whether it's appropriate to set targets in a different way for agriculture and land use, which of course is what Ireland is advocating. I would much rather see us setting targets in terms of the emissions intensity per litre of milk or per kilo of beef than simply measuring something on the basis of herd size.
What kind of reaction are you getting?
Well, as I say, the Commission paper suggests that they have an open mind on that approach. And so we will obviously be very much part of this debate. But most importantly today, I want to make sure that ministers for agriculture are very much part of this debate, because agriculture and land use is a big part of the climate change challenge and the climate change story. And so we need to be part of that discussion, and that's beginning today. Okay? Thank you.
Tell us about what's happening today in the Irish involvement in it.
Well, first of all, Ireland are spearheading the insistence today that the Council of Ministers would discuss climate change, food security in the context of Europe setting new targets for emissions by 2030. My view has been long held that Ministers for Agriculture should very much be part of the climate change debate. Nearly 10% of Europe's emissions comes from agriculture. More than 30% of Ireland's emissions comes from agriculture. And 30% of the world's emissions comes from agriculture. So we need to be very clear that there needs to be a combined approach when it comes to food security questions. We have to find a way as a globe of producing an awful lot more food in the next 2 decades, while at the same time ensuring that agriculture and food production makes a positive contribution towards the emissions problem that is contributing to a really difficult climate change challenge. And so we're insisting on that being discussed today with the view hopefully to having a more detailed discussion with the involvement of the Commission either next month or in July.
In taking that global approach, is Ireland effectively trying to say that we shouldn't confine ourselves to European limits but take a global approach in a world which needs more food? In other words, are we drawing a question mark over some of the targets which have been made in the question of climate change over the past 10 years?
Well, I think so. I think we should be setting targets, by the way. I'm not one of these people who expects agriculture to simply be excluded from target setting. What Ireland is advocating, and what I have been advocating for a number of years now, is that we should set targets in a different way for agriculture and for land use generally. What I mean by that is we need to be encouraging countries to produce food at a lower emissions intensity. We need to encourage countries to use land and maximise the potential for carbon sinks, whether that's in forestry, whether it's in permanent pasture or whatever. We need to encourage crops that are effective carbon sinks, like sugar beet, for example, so that countries think about their agricultural strategies in the context of a climate change challenge and a global food security challenge. Instead of setting simple targets like we would set for a transport sector or an energy sector, whereby reduced emissions is a good thing for a global problem. If we force targets on the basis of herd size, for example, on European countries that are producing at a low carbon intensity at the moment, we will simply force increased production in other parts of the world with a much higher emissions intensity, which makes no sense for a global problem. And so, for the first time the Commission in their paper in January recognised that perhaps we should be setting targets differently in the area of agriculture and land use in the context of a new climate change strategy for 2030. And that's very much the Irish thinking on this. And so what we're doing today is making sure that agriculture ministers are part of this debate. We have the support of 15 other countries in the European Union, and some powerful ones at that. And Ireland is spearheading this effort because we feel that this is agriculture can make a very positive contribution towards a global challenge of climate change, which is, in my view, probably the biggest challenge of our generation now. And we must do that. And so what we are not advocating is that agriculture is excluded from target setting, but what we are saying is that agriculture and land use should be set targets in a different way that is more relevant to a global challenge.
And where's your sense as to where France is on this? Traditionally, Ireland and France in matters of agriculture have worked together, but where is France now on this topic?
Well, I think France has an open mind in relation to this topic. I think countries are concerned that this discussion on agriculture may be seen by others as some sort of cop-out for agriculture. That is not what this is. I think if it was, we wouldn't have the support of countries like Germany, countries like Finland and Denmark, who are very strong climate change advocates. So we're trying to give some leadership here in what I would regard as the most important sector contributing to the climate change problem. When you have a global problem and 30% of your problem comes from one sector, and that sector is going to have to grow in terms of its output dramatically over the next 2 decades. You need to find answers through innovation, through new ways of thinking, through new technologies, and Europe needs to be leading that change as opposed to setting blunt targets in a way that may make Europe look good between now and 2030, but which would contribute negatively to a global emissions problem.
Thanks very much.
Another case to bring back sugar beet.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a million. Thank you. Thanks, Bob.